When Ruby Mae Caldwell lost everything in a single devastating week and found herself sleeping on the steps of an abandoned frontier church, she never imagined that her lowest moment would lead to discovering a Cherokee community hidden in the Canyon lands, a family that would show her the difference between surviving and truly belonging. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and desperation as Ruby Mae Caldwell pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders on the third night she'd spent sleeping on the steps of the old Mission San Miguel. The wooden church had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its whitewashed walls now weathered gray by the relentless Arizona sun and the occasional flash flood that swept through Cedar Ridge Canyon. 24 years old, with auburn hair that caught the starlight and green eyes that had seen too much hardship for someone her age, Ruby Mae counted the few coins left in her leather pouch and wondered if this was how her story would end. Alone in the high desert, with nothing but tumbleweeds and coyotes for company. 3 days ago, she'd been the schoolteacher for the small mining town of Silver Creek, 30 miles south of the Mexican border. She'd had a modest but comfortable room above Murphy's General Store, enough money to send a little home to her ailing mother in Kansas, and the respect of a community that valued education even in the roughest of frontier towns. Then everything had collapsed faster than a mine shaft in bad weather. It started when the Consolidated Mining Company pulled out of Silver Creek after their main vein played out. Within a week, half the town had packed up and moved on to chase rumors of gold strikes in Colorado or California. The school board, faced with dwindling enrollment and no tax revenue from the mining company, made the decision that cut Ruby Mae to the bone. "Miss Caldwell," said Henry Patterson, the chairman of the school board and owner of the town's only saloon, "you're a fine teacher, one of the best we've ever had. But we can't justify keeping the school open for 12 students when we can't even pay for supplies, let alone a teacher's salary." Ruby Mae had sat in that stuffy back room of Patterson's saloon, listening to men who could barely read themselves explain why education was a luxury Silver Creek could no longer afford. The irony burned like desert heat. She'd spent 2 years teaching their children to read and write, to dream of possibilities beyond the narrow canyon walls that defined their world, and now those same men were telling her that learning was expendable. The final blow came 2 days later, when Murphy's General Store closed permanently, leaving Ruby Mae without lodging. Old Pete Murphy was heading back east to live with his daughter in St. Louis, and the new owner of the building planned to convert it into additional storage for the freight company that was one of the few businesses still operating in the dying town. "I'm real sorry, Miss Ruby," Pete had said, his weathered face genuinely apologetic. "If it was up to me, you could stay as long as you needed. But the new fellow wants possession next week, and there ain't nowhere else in town that's got room for a single lady." The stage to Tucson cost $8, money Ruby Mae didn't have after sending her last wages to her mother, who was battling consumption in a Kansas sanatorium. The freight wagons heading north would take passengers for $3, but they were going to mining camps, where a single woman would face dangers that made sleeping in the desert seem like the safer choice. So Ruby Mae had packed her few belongings, a change of clothes, her father's Bible, the slate board she'd used for teaching, and a small collection of books that represented her most precious possessions, into a canvas traveling bag and started walking north along the old Spanish trail that wound through the canyon country. She'd made it 15 miles before exhaustion, and the approaching darkness forced her to seek shelter. The Mission San Miguel sat in a natural depression between two mesas, positioned where a spring provided year-round water, and a grove of cottonwood trees offered shade from the brutal summer sun. The church had been built in the 1840s by Franciscan missionaries attempting to convert the local Apache and Tohono O'odham tribes. But it had been abandoned when Apache raids made the location too dangerous to maintain. Now it served as an unofficial way station for travelers, prospectors, cowboys and drifters who needed a place to rest their horses and refill their water barrels. The church itself was locked, but the covered porch provided shelter from wind and rain, and the spring ensured fresh water for anyone desperate enough to stop in such an isolated location. Ruby May's first night on the church steps had been terrifying. Every sound in the darkness, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes, made her heart race with possibilities of danger. She'd clutched her father's old Colt revolver, the one he'd carried during his brief stint as a frontier lawman, and tried to convince herself that morning would bring better options. The second night had been worse in some ways because the fear was replaced by a crushing sense of hopelessness. Ruby May had always been the kind of person who solved problems, who found solutions when others saw only obstacles. She'd put herself through teachers' college by working as a seamstress, had convinced the Silver Creek School Board to hire a woman when they'd been planning to recruit a male teacher from back east, had created a curriculum that taught practical skills alongside traditional academics. But lying on those stone steps under a canopy of desert stars, Ruby May couldn't see a path forward. She had no money for transportation, no family or friends within hundreds of miles, no prospects for employment in a region where most towns were either dying from played-out mines or too rough for a woman traveling alone. She'd spent hours that second night writing letters in her head, to her mother, to her former colleagues, to friends from teachers' college, trying to figure out how to explain her situation without sounding like she was begging for charity. But even if she could swallow her pride and ask for help, how would anyone reach her in this God-forsaken place? The third night brought rain, a rare summer storm that swept across the high desert with surprising intensity. Ruby May huddled under the narrow overhang of the church porch, watching lightning illuminate the canyon walls in stark, dramatic shadows. The rain was cold against her skin, but she was grateful for the fresh water she could collect in her tin cup. It was during a particularly bright lightning flash that she first saw him. A figure on horseback, moving slowly along the trail that led down from the northern mesa. At first, Ruby May thought it might be her imagination, exhaustion and stress playing tricks with shadows and reflected light. But as the rider drew closer, she could make out the solid reality of horse and man, both moving with the careful confidence of those who knew the desert well. The rider stopped at the edge of the spring, about 50 yards from the church. Ruby May pressed herself against the wooden door, hoping the shadows of the porch would hide her from view. She'd heard too many stories about what happened to women alone in the desert when they encountered the wrong kind of men. But this man seemed different from the rough prospectors and cowboys who usually passed through the area. He moved with a quiet dignity, dismounting gracefully and leading his horse to drink from the spring with patient consideration for the animal's needs. His clothes were simple but well-made, leather pants and vest that had been crafted with obvious skill, a wide-brimmed hat that showed no signs of the careless wear typical of men who spent their lives in the saddle. What struck Ruby May most was his stillness. While his horse drank, the man stood motionless beside the spring, not restless or impatient like most travelers, but simply present in the moment. When lightning illuminated the scene, she caught glimpses of his face, strong features with high cheekbones, and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with careful attention. He appeared to be part Cherokee, though Ruby May had learned during her time in Arizona Territory that making assumptions about anyone's heritage was often wrong. The desert Southwest was home to dozens of tribes, plus Mexican families who'd lived in the region for generations, plus Anglo settlers from every state east of the Mississippi. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The man could have been any combination of backgrounds, and it wasn't her business to speculate. What mattered was that he didn't seem threatening. After his horse finished drinking, he led the animal to a spot near the cottonwood trees where it would have shelter from the rain. Then he did something that surprised Ruby May. He began gathering dry wood from beneath the trees, building what looked like a small campfire in a spot protected from the worst of the storm. The fire caught quickly, sending warm light dancing across the church walls. Ruby May watched from her hiding place as the man settled beside his fire, pulling supplies from his saddlebags with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to making camp in difficult conditions. The smell of coffee began to drift across the space between them, making Ruby May's stomach clench with hunger. She'd eaten her last granola bar that morning, and the scent of food reminded her how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. For a moment, she considered approaching the stranger's camp. Travelers in the desert often shared food and fire with other travelers. It was one of the unwritten codes of survival in harsh country. But something held her back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was pride. Ruby May had never been good at asking for help, and the idea of approaching a strange man to beg for food made her stomach turn with something beyond hunger. So she remained, in the shadows of the church porch, watching the warm glow of the campfire and trying to ignore the way the smell of coffee and what might have been beans or stew made her mouth water. The rain continued to fall, drumming against the church roof with a steady rhythm that should have been soothing but instead seemed to emphasize her isolation. Hours passed. The storm gradually moved east, leaving behind the clean smell of desert. Rain and air so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. Ruby May dozed fitfully, waking periodically to check on the stranger's camp and make sure her position remained hidden. It was near dawn when she woke to find the campfire reduced to glowing coals and the man standing at the edge of the spring, facing the church directly. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, Ruby May had the unsettling feeling that he was looking right at her, despite the shadows that should have concealed her presence. "Miss," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them, "you've been watching my camp for most of the night. If you're hungry, there's coffee still warm and enough food to share." Ruby May's heart stopped. She'd been so careful to stay hidden, moving only when lightning masked any sound she might make. How had he known she was there? "I know you're there," the man continued, his tone gentle but matter-of-fact. "Have been since before I made camp. No judgment on your circumstances, but if you're going to spend another night in the desert, you might as well do it with a full stomach and some hot coffee." For a long moment, Ruby May remained frozen against the church door, torn between fear and desperate hunger. The man's voice sounded kind, even respectful, but she'd learned not to trust appearances when it came to men in isolated places. "My name is Joseph Crow Dog," the stranger said, apparently willing to wait for her response. "I'm heading north to the reservation lands. Been traveling this trail for 15 years, without bothering anyone who didn't want to be bothered. Right now, I'm offering breakfast to someone who looks like they could use it. Nothing more. Nothing less." The name sounded Cherokee, which might explain his quiet confidence in the desert. The Cherokee Nation had been forced to relocate to Oklahoma decades earlier, but Ruby May knew that some Cherokee families had remained in the Southwest, adapting to desert life and maintaining their cultural connections despite the government's efforts to destroy tribal identity. Ruby May's stomach chose that moment to growl loudly enough that she was certain Joseph Crow Dog could hear it from 50 yards away. The sound made her decision for her. "I appreciate the offer," she called, back her voice hoarse from 3 days of minimal conversation. "But I don't have anything to offer in return." Joseph's response carried what might have been gentle amusement. Desert hospitality doesn't work on trade, miss. It works on the understanding that we all need help sometimes, and what goes around, it comes around when you least expect it. Slowly, Ruby May stood up from her position against the church door. Her legs were stiff from sleeping on stone, and she stumbled slightly as she made her way down the steps toward the spring. In the growing dawn light, she could see Joseph Crowdog more clearly, a man perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors, but kind eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding. "Thank you," Ruby May said as she approached his camp, keeping her traveling bag clutched tightly in one hand and her father's revolver within easy reach under her shawl. "I'm Ruby May Caldwell." Joseph nodded respectfully, gesturing toward a spot near the fire where he'd spread a blanket. "Sit, Miss Caldwell. Coffee's still hot, and there's cornbread and beans if you're interested." As Ruby May settled onto the blanket, accepting a tin cup of coffee that tasted like salvation, she found herself studying Joseph's face in the firelight. There was something about his presence that made her feel calmer than she had in days, as if his very stillness was contagious. "You're Cherokee," she said, then immediately regretted the assumption. Joseph smiled slightly. "Part Cherokee, part Irish, part stubborn desert rat. My grandmother was Cherokee Nation. My grandfather was a trader from County Cork who fell in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time in history." He handed Ruby May a plate of beans and cornbread that looked like the most appetizing meal she'd ever seen. "What about you, Miss Caldwell? What brings a schoolteacher to be sleeping on church steps in the middle of nowhere?" Ruby May paused with the coffee cup halfway to her lips. "How did you know I was a teacher?" Joseph pointed to her traveling bag, where the corner of her slate board was visible. "Slate board, books, and the way you carry yourself. Plus, your hands aren't calloused like someone who works with tools or livestock, but they've got ink stains like someone who writes a lot." "Observant," Ruby May said, impressed despite herself. "It's how you survive out here. Pay attention to details, respect what the land and the people tell you, and don't make assumptions about anyone or anything." As Ruby May ate the first real meal she'd had in 2 days, she found herself telling Joseph about Silver Creek, about the mine closure and the school shutting down, about her mother's illness and her own desperate circumstances. Something about his quiet attention made the words come easily, as if she were talking to an old friend rather than a stranger she'd met at dawn in the desert. When she finished her story, Joseph was quiet for a long time, poking at the fire with a stick and seeming to consider her situation carefully. "Silver Creek," he said finally. "I know that area. Tough country when the mines are working, tougher when they're not. Have you been there?" "Passed through a few times. Always struck me as a place that was trying too hard to be something it wasn't. Desert towns work best when they understand what the land can actually support, instead of trying to force it to be something else." Ruby May found his perspective interesting. Most people she'd met in Arizona territory were focused on extracting wealth from the land. Minerals, cattle, whatever could be taken and sold. Joseph seemed to think about the land differently, as if it were a partner rather than a resource to be exploited. "Where are you headed now?" Joseph asked, refilling her coffee cup. "I don't know," Ruby May admitted. "I was walking north, hoping to find work in Flagstaff or maybe one of the railroad towns, but I'm not sure I can make it that far on foot." Joseph was quiet again, studying her face in the growing daylight. When he spoke, his words were careful, as if he were choosing them with particular precision. "Miss Caldwell, I'm going to tell you something that might sound strange, but I'd like you to hear me out before you decide I'm crazy." Ruby May nodded, curious despite herself. "About 20 miles north of here, up in the canyon country where most folks don't bother to go, there's a small community. Mix of Cherokee families who never made it to the Oklahoma relocation, some Mexican families who've been here since before the territory was American, and a few Anglo families who got tired of trying to make the desert into something it's not. He paused, watching her reaction. It's not much by most standards. No mining, no railroad, no big ranches. Just people trying to live in harmony with what the land can actually provide. They've got a school, but no teacher. Been looking for someone. For the better part of 2 years. Ruby May felt her heart skip. A teaching position? More than that, Joseph said. A place where someone with your skills and education could make a real difference. These are good people, Miss Caldwell, but they need someone who understands both traditional education and practical frontier living. Someone who can teach their children to read and write and cipher, but also someone who respects that they might have different ideas about what education should include. The offer seemed too good to be true, which immediately made Ruby May suspicious. In her experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. "What's the catch?" she asked. Joseph smiled at her directness. "The catch is that it's not an easy life. The community is isolated, money is scarce, and you'd be working with people who've learned to be cautious about outsiders. Plus, you'd have to be willing to learn as much as you teach." Learn what? Traditional ways of living in the desert. Plant medicine, sustainable farming techniques, how to read weather patterns and water signs. The Cherokee families still maintain a lot of the old knowledge, and the Mexican families have been adapting European farming techniques to desert conditions for generations. There's wisdom there that most schools don't teach. Ruby May found herself intrigued despite her natural caution. The idea of learning indigenous knowledge while teaching traditional academics appealed to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me except that I'm sleeping on church steps." Joseph considered the question seriously. "Because 3 nights ago I had a dream about a woman with red hair who was lost in the desert, but would find her way home if someone pointed her in the right direction. Because my grandmother always told me to pay attention to dreams, especially ones that repeat 3 nights in a row." He paused, then continued. "And because you reminded me of my cousin Sarah when she first came to live with our family. She was about your age, had lost everything in a flood back in Oklahoma, and didn't know where she belonged anymore. But she found her place with us, learned our ways while teaching us some of hers. What happened to her? She's the community's midwife now, and one of our most respected elders, even though she's only been with us for 8 years. Sometimes finding your people isn't about blood or birth. Sometimes it's about recognizing where your spirit feels at home." Ruby May sat quietly, absorbing Joseph's words and the implications of his offer. The coffee had warmed her from the inside out, and the food had restored enough of her strength that she could think clearly for the first time in days. "If I were to consider this," she said carefully, "what would be expected of me?" "Honesty," Joseph replied immediately. "Respect for our ways while sharing your own knowledge. Willingness to learn from people who might not have formal education but understand things that books don't teach. And patience, because change happens slowly in small communities. And if it doesn't work out, then we help you get to wherever you want to go next. No hard feelings, no obligations, but Miss Caldwell, I think you might be surprised by how much you like it there." Ruby May looked around at the desert landscape, now fully illuminated by the rising sun. The canyon walls caught the light in shades of red and gold that were almost impossibly beautiful, and she could hear the calls of awakening birds from the cottonwood trees. For the first time since leaving Silver Creek, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. How far did you say it was? 20 miles by the direct route, but we'd take the longer trail to avoid some rough country. 2 days of easy riding, if you're willing to share my horse and camping gear. The offer was generous, almost beyond belief. But something in Joseph's manner convinced Ruby May that it was genuine. Maybe it was the way he'd approached her situation, without judgment. Or maybe it was the dream he'd mentioned, or maybe it was simply that she had no better options. Mr. Crow Dog, she said, extending her hand in a gesture that felt like stepping off a cliff. I think I'd like to see this community of yours. Joseph's smile was warm as he shook her hand. Welcome to the beginning of your real journey, Miss Caldwell. I have a feeling you're going to find more than just a teaching job up in those canyons. As they prepared to break camp and begin the ride north, Ruby May felt something she hadn't experienced in months, anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and challenging and full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. Behind them, the old Mission San Miguel sat silent in the growing heat of the day, ready to shelter the next desperate traveler who needed refuge. But Ruby May was no longer looking backward. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she was looking ahead. The journey into the canyon lands revealed secrets that Ruby May had never imagined could exist in the harsh Arizona territory. As Joseph's horse picked its way along ancient trails that seemed invisible until you were actually walking them, Ruby May began to understand that she was entering a world that most outsiders would never see, and that was entirely by design. The first day of riding had been a revelation in itself. Joseph's horse, a sturdy paint mare named Sage, carried both riders with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that knew every rock and route along the trail. Ruby May, who had grown up riding farm horses in Kansas, was impressed by how smoothly the mare navigated terrain that would have challenged most horses she'd known. More impressive still was Joseph's knowledge of the landscape. He read the desert like Ruby May read books, with deep comprehension and the ability to find meaning in details that others might overlook. He pointed out plants that stored water in their roots, rocks formations that indicated underground springs, and animal tracks that told stories about who had passed this way and when. See those scratch marks on that Palo Verde tree? Joseph asked, pointing to markings Ruby May would have walked past without noticing. Mountain lion territory marker, male, probably about 150 pounds, marked it 3 days ago after the rain. How? Can you tell all that from scratches on bark? Height of the marks tells you size, depth tells you how recently they were made, and the scent, if you know how to read it, tells you gender and general health. My grandmother taught me that everything in the desert has a voice if you learn the language. They made camp that first night in a hidden box canyon, where a spring fed a small oasis of grass and mesquite trees. As Joseph prepared a simple meal of dried meat, beans, and something he called pinole, a nutritious mixture of ground corn, nuts, and spices, Ruby May found herself watching his every movement with growing fascination. Everything he did seemed purposeful and efficient, but never hurried. He gathered firewood with obvious attention to which species would burn cleanest and longest. He positioned their camp to take advantage of natural windbreaks while maintaining clear sight lines to all approaches. He even hobbled Sage in a spot where she could graze comfortably while being able to alert them to any approaching danger. You move like someone who spent his whole life in the wilderness, Ruby May observed as they shared the evening meal. Joseph smiled. Not my whole life, but most of it. Spent my early childhood on the reservation in Oklahoma before my family decided to come west. Been living in the canyon country since I was 12. That must have been difficult, adapting to such different terrain in some ways, but Cherokee people have always been adaptable. We learned to live in the southeastern forests. Then we learned to survive the Trail of Tears and reservation life in Oklahoma. Then some of us learned to thrive in the desert. Adaptation is survival. Ruby May found herself thinking about her own struggles with adaptation. She'd always prided herself on being resourceful and resilient, but the past week had shown her how quickly circumstances could overwhelm her ability to cope. What about the community we're going to? She asked. How did it start? Joseph poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing into the desert night. It began about 20 years ago, when my uncle Thomas Crow Dog was traveling through this area with a small group of Cherokee families who had decided to leave Oklahoma. They were looking for a place where they could live according to traditional ways without interference from government agents or missionaries. He paused, collecting his thoughts. At the same time, there was a Mexican family named Herrera who had been living in these canyons for generations, dating back to when this was all part of Mexico, and an Anglo family named Murphy, no relation to Pete Murphy from Silver Creek, who had come west after losing their farm in Missouri to drought and debt. Unlikely neighbors, Ruby May commented. That's what everyone thought at first. But it turned out they all wanted the same things: to be left alone to live their lives, to raise their children with dignity, and to work with the land instead of against it. They started sharing resources during a particularly hard winter, and, before long, they realized they were stronger together than apart. Joseph's description of the community's origins fascinated Ruby May. She'd grown up in a Kansas farming community where ethnic divisions were sharp and often hostile. The idea of Cherokee, Mexican, and Anglo families choosing to live and work together seemed almost utopian. How do they make it work, she asked. The cultural differences alone must create challenges. They do, Joseph admitted, but they've learned that different approaches to the same problems often create better solutions than any one group could develop alone. The Cherokee families know traditional farming techniques and plant medicine. The Herrera family understands desert water management and livestock breeding. The Murphy family brought mechanical skills and knowledge of Anglo legal systems, and they actually cooperate. More than that, their children are growing up trilingual, Cherokee, Spanish, and English. They're learning traditional healing alongside modern medicine. They're developing farming techniques that combine indigenous knowledge with European methods adapted for desert conditions. Ruby May tried to imagine such a place and found herself both intrigued and skeptical. In her experience, idealistic communities often looked better in theory than in practice. The second day of travel took them deeper into canyon country that seemed increasingly remote and secretive. The trail wound through narrow passages between towering red rock walls, across hidden meadows where wildflowers bloomed in impossible abundance, and along the edges of mesas that offered views of landscape that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "Are we still in Arizona territory?" Ruby May asked during one of their rest stops. Joseph grinned. "Depends on who you ask. Officially, yes. But out here, territorial boundaries don't mean much. The land doesn't care about lines drawn on maps in Washington. Doesn't that create legal problems? Only if you let the outside world know where you are." The implications of his statement began to sink in as they continued riding. This wasn't just a remote community. It was a deliberately hidden one. Ruby May wondered what she was getting herself into. Late in the afternoon of the second day, they reached what looked like a dead end, a sheer rock wall rising several hundred feet into the desert sky. But Joseph guided Sage toward what appeared to be a solid section of stone, and as they got closer, Ruby May realized that shadows and perspective had hidden a narrow passage that was just wide enough for a horse and rider. "This is the entrance," Joseph said. "Hold tight. It gets narrow for about 50 feet, then opens up into something you'll need to see to believe." The passage was so narrow that Ruby May's knees almost brushed the rock walls on either side. The walls rose so high above them that only a thin strip of sky was visible, and the temperature dropped noticeably in the perpetual shadow. For a moment, Ruby May felt a flutter of claustrophobia and wondered if they were trapped in some kind of natural prison. Then they emerged into a hidden valley that took Ruby May's breath away. The valley was perhaps 2 miles long and a mile wide, completely enclosed by towering canyon walls that would be invisible from the surrounding desert. A clear stream ran down the center, fed by springs that emerged from the rock walls at several points. The valley floor was green with grass, vegetables gardens, and fruit trees that seemed impossible in the desert landscape they'd been traveling through. But it was the sight of the community itself that made Ruby May's heart skip. Adobe houses with red tile roofs sat comfortably along the stream, their architecture clearly influenced by Mexican building traditions, but adapted with features that suggested Cherokee and Anglo influences as well. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could see people working in gardens, children playing near the stream, and horses grazing in fenced pastures. "Welcome to yonder valley," Joseph said, using the English name the community had adopted for dealing with outsiders. Though most of us just call it home. As they rode down into the valley, Ruby May noticed details that reinforced Joseph's descriptions of the community's cooperative nature. The gardens showed evidence of both indigenous Three Sisters planting, corn, beans, and squash grown together, and European-style row crops. The architecture combined Mexican adobe techniques with Cherokee design elements and Anglo practical innovations like glass windows and metal roofing. Children playing near the stream looked up as they approached, and Ruby May was struck by the diversity of their faces, some clearly Cherokee, others obviously Mexican, and still others showing the mixed heritage that was becoming common in frontier communities. But what struck her most was their confidence and curiosity. These children didn't look like they'd been raised to fear strangers or hide from the outside world. "Joseph!" called a woman working in one of the gardens. She spoke in Cherokee, but her tone was clearly welcoming. Joseph responded in the same language, then switched to English for Ruby May's benefit. "This is Miss Ruby May Caldwell, the teacher I told you about. Ruby May, this is my cousin Sarah Crow Dog, the midwife I mentioned. Sarah was a woman in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and hands that showed the calluses of hard work." She wiped dirt from her palms before extending her hand to Ruby May. "Welcome to our valley," Sarah said warmly. Joseph sent word ahead that he'd found someone who might be interested in teaching our children. "We've been looking forward to meeting you." "Sent word ahead?" Ruby May asked, confused. They'd been traveling together for 2 days without Joseph. "Sending any messages?" Sarah smiled. "Smoke signals, old communication method, but it works better than telegraph out here." Ruby May looked back toward the canyon entrance, remembering several points during their journey when Joseph had built small fires that had seemed unnecessary for cooking or warmth. She'd assumed he was just being cautious about having fire readily available, but apparently he'd been sending coded messages to the community. "You've been telling them about me since we left the mission," Ruby May realized. "Telling them a teacher was coming, asking them to prepare for a visitor who might stay," Joseph confirmed. "I wanted to make sure you'd be welcomed properly. Over." The next few hours, Ruby May was introduced to what seemed like the entire community. The Cherokee families included Joseph's uncle Thomas Crow Dog, the community's unofficial leader, his wife Margaret, who served as both traditional healer and practical doctor, and several other families with children of school age. The Herrera family patriarch was Don Miguel Herrera, a man in his 60s whose family had been living in the region since the 1830s. His son Carlos served as the community's expert on water, management and livestock, while his daughter Maria had become their most skilled weaver and textile producer. The Anglo families were represented by the Murphys, James and Elizabeth Murphy and their 3 children, and the Washingtons, former slaves who had made their way west after the Civil War and been welcomed into the community based on James Washington's skills as a blacksmith and his wife Ruth's knowledge of medicinal plants learned from her grandmother. What impressed Ruby May most was how naturally the different families interacted. Children switched between languages mid-conversation. Adults consulted each other on problems regardless of ethnic background, and there seemed to be a genuine sense of shared purpose that transcended cultural divisions. How many children would I be teaching? Ruby May asked Thomas Crow Dog as the community gathered for an evening meal around a large fire pit in the center of the settlement. 18, ranging in age from 6 to 15, Thomas replied. Some read well in one language but struggle in others. Some have strong mathematical skills but need help with formal writing. All of them are eager to learn, but they also have responsibilities to their families that can't be ignored. What kind of responsibilities? Helping with planting and harvest, caring for younger siblings, learning traditional crafts and skills that won't be taught in any formal classroom. We need a teacher who understands that education includes more than books and slates. Ruby May found the concept appealing. In Silver Creek, she'd often felt constrained by rigid curriculum requirements that seemed disconnected from the practical needs of frontier life. What would you expect me to teach them? Reading, writing, and mathematics, certainly, said Margaret Crow Dog, but also geography, basic science, and history, including the history that most textbooks don't include. The true history of Indian peoples, Mexican land grants, and what really happened to families like ours during westward expansion, added Don Miguel. Our children need to understand the world they're growing up in, not just the version that makes Anglo settlers feel comfortable. The educational philosophy they described was more sophisticated and challenging than anything Ruby May had encountered. Informal teacher training. They wanted their children to be fully literate and numerate by Anglo standards, but also grounded in their own cultural traditions and aware of historical truths that were often suppressed in mainstream education. It won't be easy, warned James Murphy. These children are smart and curious, but they're also independent-minded. They won't respect authority just because you're the teacher. You'll have to earn their attention and trust. What about supplies? Books, paper, writing materials? We have some basic supplies, said Carlos Herrera, but you'd need to be creative about teaching materials. We've found that practical lessons often work better than abstract ones. As the evening progressed, Ruby May found herself drawn into conversations about community life that revealed both the challenges and the rewards of their cooperative lifestyle. The valley was largely self-sufficient. They grew their own food, raised their own livestock, and produced most of their clothing and tools. But they weren't completely isolated from the outside world. Several men in the community made regular trading trips to frontier towns, exchanging surplus crops and handmade goods for manufactured items they couldn't produce themselves. These trips also served as intelligence-gathering missions, keeping the community informed about political developments, economic changes, and potential threats to their way of life. The key to our survival, explained Thomas Crow Dog, is remaining invisible to people who might want to control or exploit us, while maintaining enough contact with the outside world to avoid being caught off guard by changes that might affect us. What kind of threats do you worry about? Ruby May asked. Government agents who might decide we're not paying enough taxes or following territorial laws, said James Murphy. Military forces who might see us as a potential Indian uprising, even though most of our Cherokee families are here legally. Mexican authorities who might dispute land claims dating back to the pre-territorial period. And mining companies who might discover that our valley has mineral potential, added Carlos Herrera grimly. We've been lucky so far, but if someone found gold or silver deposits in these hills, our isolation wouldn't protect us. The complexity of the community's situation was beginning to dawn on Ruby May. This wasn't just a remote farming settlement. It was a carefully balanced experiment in alternative living that required constant vigilance and sophisticated planning. To maintain, why are you willing to trust me with all this? She asked. You're sharing information that could be dangerous if it reached the wrong people. The community members exchanged glances, and Ruby May sensed some kind of silent communication taking place. Finally, Margaret Crow Dog spoke. Because Joseph dreamed about you for 3 nights before he found you, and because my grandmother's spirit came to me in a vision last week, telling me that a red-haired woman would come to teach our children and help prepare them for changes that are coming. Changes. The outside world is closing in on places like this, Thomas said seriously. Railroad surveys, mining expeditions, territorial government expansion. We may not be able to remain hidden forever. When that time comes, our children will need to be prepared to navigate both worlds, traditional and modern, indigenous and Anglo, rural and urban. You're asking me to prepare them for a world that might destroy everything you've built here. We're asking you to give them the tools. They'll need to preserve what matters most, regardless of what the future brings. Ruby May sat quietly, absorbing the weight of what the community was asking of her. This was far more than a simple teaching position. They wanted her to help prepare the next generation for cultural survival in a rapidly changing world. As the fire burned low and families began drifting back to their homes, Sarah Crow Dog approached Ruby May with a proposition that would shape her decision. "There's something else you should know," Sarah said quietly. "Joseph didn't tell you everything about why he was traveling that trail where he found you." "What do you mean?" "He's been making regular trips to various towns and settlements, looking for people who might fit into our community. Teachers, doctors, craftsmen, farmers, people with skills we need, but also people who understand that some things are more important than money or social status." Ruby May felt a flutter of something between suspicion and intrigue. He was recruiting. He was searching. There's a difference. We don't try to convince people to join us. We look for people who are already searching for something they can't find in conventional society. "And you think I'm one of those people?" Sarah smiled. "Joseph found you sleeping on church steps rather than accepting charity or compromising. Your principles for survival. That tells us something about your character. It tells you I'm stubborn and possibly foolish. It tells us you value dignity and independence more than comfort and security. Those are qualities we need in someone who's going to help shape our children's futures." As Ruby May walked to the small adobe house that had been prepared for her, she found herself torn between excitement and uncertainty. The community offered everything she'd been looking for: meaningful work, a place where her skills would be valued, and a chance to be part of something larger than herself. But it also represented a commitment to a way of life that was deliberately separated from mainstream society. If she accepted their offer, she would be choosing isolation, uncertainty, and the constant possibility that the outside world might discover and destroy everything they'd built. Standing in the doorway of her temporary home, looking out over a hidden valley illuminated by starlight, Ruby May realized that her decision would determine not just her own future, but the futures of 18 children who deserved the best education she could provide. The question was whether she had the courage to embrace a destiny she'd never imagined possible. Ruby May's first morning as the teacher of Yonder Valley began with a shock that nearly sent her packing before she'd even started. She arrived at the designated schoolhouse, a beautiful adobe building with large windows and hand-carved wooden desks, to find it completely empty. Not a single student had shown up for the first day of classes. Standing alone in the classroom, she'd spent hours the night before, arranging with careful attention to lighting, seating arrangements, and learning materials. Ruby May felt the familiar sting of rejection and failure. Had the community changed their minds about wanting a teacher? Had the children decided they didn't want formal education? She was still standing there, trying to decide whether to feel hurt or angry, when 8-year-old Maria Herrera appeared. In the doorway, her dark eyes bright with mischief. "Miss Ruby May," Maria said in accented but clear English, "Abuela says to tell you that today is not a day for sitting inside. Today is a day for learning whether you understand what teaching really means." Before Ruby May could ask what that meant, Maria had darted away, leaving behind only the sound of her bare feet on the adobe floor and a cryptic message that did nothing to clarify the situation. Ruby May spent the next hour wandering the valley, looking for her missing students and trying to understand what kind of test she was apparently failing. She found them, eventually, scattered across different work sites throughout the community, each engaged in tasks that were clearly considered more important than formal schooling. 10-year-old Samuel Murphy was helping his father repair a water wheel that powered the community's grain mill. 12-year-old Running Bear Crow Dog was working with his grandmother to harvest medicinal plants that needed to be gathered at precisely the right time of day. 15-year-old Carlos Herrera Jr. was assisting with the delicate process of training, a young horse that had been born wild and needed patient, skilled handling to become useful. At each location, Ruby May was greeted politely but with a clear message. The work the children were doing was too important to abandon for something as abstract as classroom lessons. But this is exactly the problem, Ruby May finally said in frustration when she found Thomas Crow Dog overseeing a group of children who were learning to identify and collect different types of clay for pottery making. How can I teach them to read and write if they're never in the classroom? Thomas looked up from the clay samples the children had collected, his weathered face showing what might have been amusement. Miss Caldwell, do you know why we call this Yonder Valley? I assumed it was because it's hidden away from everything else. Partly, but mostly it's because yonder means over there, somewhere else, somewhere different from where you are. Now, this valley represents a different way of thinking about education, about community, about what children need to learn to become useful adults. He gestured toward the children, who were now testing different clay samples for plasticity and color. Samuel Murphy is learning mathematics by calculating water flow rates and gear ratios. Running Bear is studying botany, chemistry, and pharmacology by learning which plants heal and why. Carlos Jr. is learning animal psychology, patience, and leadership by working with that horse. But they also need to learn formal academics, Ruby May protested. Reading, writing, history, geography. Of course they do, but not by sitting in rows, memorizing facts that have no connection to their daily lives. They need to learn those skills as tools for understanding and improving the world they actually live in. Thomas stood up, brushing clay dust from his hands. Your test, Miss Caldwell, is not to convince our children to abandon their responsibilities for the privilege of sitting in a classroom. Your test is to figure out how to bring education to them where they are, doing the work that matters. The challenge was unlike anything Ruby May had encountered in her teacher training, which had focused entirely on classroom management and curriculum delivery. How was she supposed to teach formal lessons to children who were scattered across the valley, engaged in completely different activities? Her answer came from an unexpected source. 13-year-old Eleanor Washington, the blacksmith's daughter, who found Ruby May sitting by the stream at midday, looking overwhelmed and uncertain. "Miss Ruby May," Eleanor said, settling down beside her on the grass. "Mama says you look like someone who's trying to plant corn in a rock garden." "What does that mean?" "Means you're trying to use the wrong method for the right goal. You want to teach us things we need to know, but you're thinking about it like we're town children who don't have anything important to do." Elena picked up a handful of smooth river stones, sorting them by size and color as she talked. "But we do have important things to do. So you have to figure out how to teach us while we're doing them, or teach us things that make us better at doing them. How do you suggest I do that?" Elena grinned, revealing a gap where she'd recently lost a tooth. "Come work with us, learn what we're learning, then figure out how reading and writing and numbers make us better at the work we're already doing." The suggestion was so simple and obvious that Ruby May felt embarrassed for not thinking of it herself. Instead of trying to separate education from daily life, she needed to integrate them completely. That afternoon, Ruby May began what would become the most innovative teaching experiment of her career. She started with Samuel Murphy and the Water Wheel Project, watching carefully as father and son worked to adjust the gear ratios that controlled the mill's grinding speed. "Samuel," Ruby May said, pulling out a slate board and chalk, "can you show me how you calculate the water flow rate?" Samuel looked surprised but pleased to be asked. "Well, we measure how much water flows past this point in 1 minute. Then we figure out how fast the wheel needs to turn to grind the grain at the right speed." "And how do you measure the water flow?" "We drop a stick in the water up there and time how long it takes to reach this point. Then we multiply by the width and depth of the stream." Ruby May began writing on the slate board, translating Samuel's practical knowledge into mathematical formulas. "So you're calculating volume times velocity to determine flow rate, and then you're using ratio calculations to determine optimal gear configurations." Samuel's father, James Murphy, paused in his work to watch what Ruby May was doing. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "The boy's been doing advanced mathematics all along. I just never thought of it that way." Within an hour, Ruby May had Samuel reading from a technical manual about mill operations, writing calculations in a permanent logbook, and explaining his work to other children who had gathered to watch. The abstract concepts of mathematics and literacy suddenly had immediate, practical applications that made perfect sense to a frontier child. Word of the successful integration spread quickly through the small community, and by the next morning, Ruby May found herself invited to participate in dozens of different educational opportunities that she'd never considered. With Running Bear and his grandmother Margaret, Ruby May learned to create detailed botanical illustrations, while the boy studied the Latin names and scientific classifications of medicinal plants. What started as an art lesson became a science class that incorporated geography, history, and cultural studies, as Margaret explained which plants had been used by Cherokee healers for generations and which had been adopted from other tribes or Mexican traditions. "This is desert willow," Margaret explained, as Running Bear carefully sketched the plant's distinctive leaves and flowers. "In Cherokee, we call it water seeker, because it grows where underground streams run, even when you can't see water on the surface." Ruby May helped Running Bear write detailed descriptions of each plant's characteristics, habitat requirements, and traditional uses. By the end of the morning, he had produced what amounted to a field guide entry that demonstrated mastery of scientific observation, artistic technique, and expository writing. With Carlos Jr. and the Horse Training Project, Ruby May discovered opportunities to teach animal behavior, psychology, and the kind of patient problem-solving that would serve any child well in adult life. As Carlos worked with the young Mustang, Ruby May helped him document his methods and observations in a training journal that became an exercise in technical writing and analytical thinking. "The horse is afraid because he's never been touched by humans," Carlos explained as he slowly approached the nervous animal. "So I have to show him that I'm not a predator, that I understand his language." "What kind of language do horses use?" Ruby May asked, genuinely curious. "Body language, mostly. The way they hold their ears, how they position their bodies, whether they're tense or relaxed. If I can read what he's telling me and respond appropriately, he'll start to trust me." Ruby May helped Carlos create detailed behavioral charts, tracking the horse's responses to different training approaches and developing written protocols for working with wild animals. The project became a comprehensive study in observation, hypothesis testing, and communication that incorporated elements of science, psychology, and technical writing. But perhaps the most successful integration came when Ruby May joined the Pottery Project with Thomas Crow Dog and a mixed group of children, ranging in age from 6 to 14. What began as a lesson in traditional crafts became an interdisciplinary exploration of geology, chemistry, mathematics, history, and cultural studies. Different clays have different properties, Thomas explained as the children tested various clay samples for plasticity and firing characteristics. Some are good for everyday pots, some are better for ceremonial pieces, some can withstand very high temperatures for cooking. Ruby May helped the children create detailed comparison charts, documenting the characteristics of each clay type and mapping their collection locations. The younger children practiced basic writing skills by labeling samples and recording simple observations. The older children wrote comprehensive reports comparing traditional Cherokee pottery techniques with Mexican and Anglo methods, analyzing the cultural and practical reasons for different approaches. "Why do Cherokee pots have different shapes than Mexican pots?" asked 10-year-old Sarah Murphy, comparing examples of different pottery styles. "Different purposes, different traditions, different available materials," Thomas replied. Cherokee pots were often made for carrying water long distances, so they needed to be strong and balanced. Mexican pots were often made for cooking over open fires, so they needed to distribute heat evenly. The conversation led to a geography lesson about how environment shapes culture, a history lesson about trade relationships between different peoples, and a mathematics lesson about calculating volumes and proportions for different pot shapes. By the end of her first week in Yonder Valley, Ruby May had developed a completely new understanding of what education could be. Instead of trying to separate learning from living, she had discovered ways to make every aspect of daily life into an opportunity for developing academic skills. The children were reading technical manuals, scientific journals, and historical documents because they needed information to improve their work. They were writing detailed observations, project reports, and instruction guides because they needed to document and share their knowledge. They were calculating measurements, ratios, and proportions because they needed mathematical precision to achieve practical goals. Most importantly, they were learning to think critically, solve problems creatively, and communicate effectively because these skills were essential for the kind of cooperative, self-sufficient community they were growing up in. But Ruby May's educational innovations were creating unexpected challenges that threatened to disrupt the delicate balance of community life. The success of her integrated teaching methods was attracting attention from outside the valley. Attention that could prove dangerous for a community that depended on remaining hidden. The problem began when Carlos Herrera Sr. returned from a trading trip to Tucson with disturbing news. "There's a man asking questions," he reported to the community leaders during an evening meeting. "Government surveyor named Patterson claims he's mapping water rights for the territorial administration. But he's asking specific questions about hidden settlements and unreported agricultural operations." Thomas Crow Dog frowned. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about where Apache families might be hiding, about Mexican families who might not have proper land titles, about Anglo families who might be avoiding taxes or military service, but also questions about schools and teachers, about children who should be registered with territorial education authorities." Ruby May felt her stomach drop. "You think he's looking for us specifically?" "Hard to say," Carlos replied. "But he mentioned hearing rumors about a progressive educational experiment involving Indian children and Mexican families. Those are pretty specific details for someone who's supposedly just mapping water rights." The implications were terrifying. If territorial authorities discovered the valley, they could dismantle the community's carefully constructed way of life. Cherokee families could be forced to relocate to reservations. Mexican families could have their land claims challenged. Anglo families could face prosecution for tax evasion or failure to comply with territorial laws, and Ruby May herself could be arrested for operating an unlicensed school and teaching children who weren't properly registered with territorial authorities. "What do we do?" asked Margaret Crow Dog. "We prepare," Thomas said grimly. "And we hope that Miss Caldwell's teaching methods have prepared our children for the kind of challenges they might face if our isolation is compromised." The next morning, Ruby May found herself teaching lessons she'd never imagined would be necessary. Working with the older children, she began preparing them for the possibility that they might need to interact with territorial authorities, Anglo school inspectors, or other representatives of the outside world. "If someone asks you what you're learning in school," Ruby May explained to 15-year-old Carlos Jr., "you need to be able to demonstrate that you can read, write, and calculate as well as any child your age in Tucson or Phoenix." "But what if they ask about our teachers or where our school is located?" You tell them the truth, that you're being educated by qualified instructors in reading, writing, mathematics, science, and history. You don't volunteer information about our location or our teaching methods unless specifically asked. The preparation sessions revealed just how much the children had actually learned through Ruby May's integrated approach. When tested on formal academic skills, they performed at levels that would have impressed even the most demanding territorial education inspectors. But they had also developed practical knowledge, critical thinking abilities, and cultural awareness that went far beyond anything available in conventional frontier schools. The real test came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days after Carlos's warning, a dust cloud on the eastern horizon announced the arrival of visitors to Yonder Valley. Through binoculars, the community watchers identified 2 horsemen approaching along one of the concealed trails that led into the valley. "Government, surveyor, and a territorial marshal," reported James Washington from his observation post on the eastern rim. "They found one of our trails somehow." The community had prepared for this possibility, but the reality of discovery was still shocking. Within minutes, families were implementing carefully rehearsed plans for concealing evidence of their unconventional lifestyle and presenting a facade that would satisfy official scrutiny. Ruby May found herself at the center of the deception, responsible for presenting an educational program that would appear completely conventional to outside observers, while protecting the innovative methods that had made her teaching so successful. As the 2 officials rode into the valley, Ruby May stood in front of the schoolhouse with 18 children arranged in perfectly traditional rows, reciting multiplication tables in the kind of mindless chorus that characterized frontier education throughout the territory. But behind the facade of conventional teaching, Ruby May knew that these children possessed knowledge, skills, and understanding that no government inspector could possibly measure or appreciate. The question was whether their performance could protect the community that had given them such an extraordinary education. The survival of Yonder Valley, and everything Ruby May had come to love about her new life, would depend on how well her students had learned to navigate between the world they were growing up in and the world that was rapidly closing in around them. The territorial marshal's name was William Crawford, and he had the kind of pale, calculating eyes that seemed to catalog every detail for future use. His companion, the surveyor Patterson, was a nervous man who kept consulting maps and making notes in a leather-bound journal that he guarded like it contained state secrets. Ruby May watched them from the schoolhouse window as they rode into the valley, noting how Crawford's hand rested casually on his revolver and how Patterson's eyes swept the settlement with obvious interest in defensive positions and escape routes. These men weren't just conducting routine territorial business, they were gathering intelligence. "Miss Caldwell," Thomas Crow Dog appeared beside her at the window, his voice carefully controlled. Remember that today you are simply a frontier schoolteacher working with local children. Nothing more, nothing less. What if they ask about my credentials, my background? Tell them the truth, that you were educated in Kansas and previously taught in Silver Creek. Don't volunteer information about how you came to be here. Ruby May nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. Everything she'd built in yonder valley, everything the community had worked for over 2 decades, could be destroyed by a single misspoken word or suspicious observation. The children had performed brilliantly during the morning's charade, demonstrating perfect mastery of conventional academic skills while hiding the revolutionary teaching methods that had made their education so comprehensive. But Ruby May knew that the real test was just beginning. Crawford and Patterson dismounted at the community's central gathering area, where Thomas Crow Dog waited to greet them with the careful courtesy that frontier communities showed to potentially dangerous visitors. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, his English carefully formal and devoid of any accent that might mark him as Cherokee, "welcome to our settlement. I'm Thomas Crowder." He used the anglicized version of his name that appeared on territorial documents, chairman of the local school board. Ruby May noticed the seamless way Thomas had transformed himself from traditional Cherokee elder to conventional frontier leader. Even his posture had changed, becoming more rigid and European in style. "Marshal Crawford, Territorial Authority," the lawman replied, flashing a badge that glinted in the desert sun. "This is Surveyor Patterson, working on water rights documentation for the Territorial Administration. We're investigating reports of unlicensed educational activities and unregistered settlements in this region." Educational activities. Thomas managed to sound genuinely puzzled. "We run a small school for local children, fully compliant with territorial requirements. Perhaps you'd like to observe our classes." Patterson consulted his journal. "We've received reports of an experimental program involving Indian children, Mexican families, and unconventional teaching methods. Possible violations of territorial education codes and federal Indian policies." Ruby May felt her stomach clench. Someone had provided very specific information about their community, too specific to be accidental discovery. "I think there may be some confusion," Thomas replied smoothly. "Our school serves children from local ranching families, following standard curriculum guidelines. Miss Caldwell, our teacher, has proper credentials from Teachers College in Kansas." Crawford's pale eyes fixed on Ruby May with uncomfortable intensity. "Miss Caldwell, is it? I'd like to speak with you about your educational program." Ruby May stepped forward, hoping her nervousness would be interpreted as natural frontier caution rather than guilt. "Of course, Marshal. Though I'm not sure what questions you might have about a simple frontier school. Let's start with your student. Enrollment. How many children, what ages, what family backgrounds?" 18 students, ages 6 through 15, Ruby May replied, sticking to facts that could be easily verified. "Children from local families engaged in ranching, farming, and related enterprises." "And these families, what's their ethnic composition?" The question was clearly designed to elicit information about Cherokee and Mexican residents, but Ruby May had prepared for this line of inquiry. "Mixed, as is typical in frontier communities. Some families trace their ancestry to various eastern states. Others have been in the Southwest for generations. Arizona Territory has always been home to diverse populations." It was technically true, while avoiding specific details that could be used against the community. Patterson looked up from his journal. "We'd like to observe your teaching methods, examine your curriculum materials, and interview some of your students." "Certainly," Ruby May agreed, though her heart was pounding. "Though I should mention that today's lessons focus on basic academics, reading, Writing arithmetic, nothing that would qualify as experimental or unusual. The tour that followed was the most nerve-wracking experience of Ruby May's life. She led Crawford and Patterson through a completely conventional demonstration of frontier education, while 18 children performed like seasoned actors in a play that could determine their community's survival. Samuel Murphy recited multiplication, tables with perfect precision, showing no sign that he typically learned mathematics by calculating water flow rates and gear ratios for complex mechanical systems. Running Bear Crow Dog read aloud from a standard geography textbook, giving no indication that his usual studies involved creating detailed botanical surveys and traditional plant medicine documentation. Elena Washington demonstrated her penmanship by copying moral verses from a primer, concealing the fact that she typically wrote technical reports about blacksmithing techniques and metallurgy. Carlos Jr. solved arithmetic problems on a slate board, hiding his expertise in animal behavior analysis and training methodology. The performance was flawless, but Ruby May could see the strain it placed on children who were accustomed to engaging with complex, meaningful projects rather than rote memorization and repetitive exercises. "Impressive," Crawford commented as they completed the classroom observation. "Your students seem quite well prepared in basic academics." "Thank you, Ruby," May replied, trying to interpret whether his tone suggested suspicion or genuine approval. Patterson was making extensive notes about everything he observed: the classroom layout, the educational materials, even the children's clothing and general appearance. "Miss Caldwell, where did you acquire your teaching materials? These textbooks appear to be quite current." Ruby May's pulse quickened. The textbooks were indeed current, purchased during trading expeditions to larger towns, but she needed to explain their presence without revealing the community's sophisticated supply networks. "Ordered from suppliers in Tucson and Phoenix," she said. "The community believes strongly in providing quality education for our children." "Expensive for a remote settlement," Crawford observed. "Education is a priority here. Families pool resources to ensure their children have the same opportunities available in larger towns." It was another technically truthful statement that concealed the community's complex economic arrangements and cooperative decision-making processes. But the real challenge came when Patterson requested interviews with individual students. Ruby May watched with growing anxiety as he separated 15-year-old Carlos Jr. from the group for private questioning. "Son," Patterson said, settling onto a bench outside the schoolhouse, "tell me about your education here. What subjects do you study?" Carlos Jr. looked toward Ruby May with carefully concealed panic. They had prepared for this possibility, but the reality of deception under direct questioning was more difficult than any rehearsal. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history," Carlos replied, sticking to the conventional curriculum they had demonstrated. "And your teacher, Miss Caldwell? How long has she been here?" "About 2 months, sir. Where did your education take place before she arrived?" This was dangerous territory. Carlos couldn't reveal that the community had been without formal schooling for 2 years, as that would raise questions about why children his age were so well educated. "Various community members helped with lessons," Carlos said carefully. "My father taught mathematics, my mother helped with reading, other adults contributed what they could." Patterson made notes. "And what do you plan to do with your education?" "Continue schooling elsewhere, help my family with ranching operations, sir. Maybe start my own spread someday." It was a perfectly conventional answer for a frontier child, revealing nothing about Carlos's sophisticated understanding of animal psychology, sustainable agriculture, or cross-cultural cooperation. The interview continued for 20 minutes, with Patterson probing for details about family backgrounds, community structure, and educational philosophy. Carlos Jr. navigated every question with the skill of someone much older, providing truthful but carefully limited information that satisfied official curiosity without revealing community secrets. But Ruby May's relief was short-lived. As Patterson finished his interview with Carlos Jr., Crawford approached her with a request that sent ice through her veins. "Miss Caldwell, I'd like to examine your teaching credentials and employment documentation." Ruby May had dreaded this moment. While her teaching qualifications were legitimate, her employment in Yonder Valley existed outside any official territorial framework. The community couldn't risk creating documented connections to territorial authorities. "Of course," Ruby May replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "My credentials are in my quarters, if you'd like to accompany me." The walk to her small adobe house felt like a march to execution. Ruby May's mind raced through possible explanations for why a qualified teacher would be working in an undocumented position in a hidden valley. Inside her quarters, Ruby May retrieved her teaching certificate from Kansas, her letters of recommendation from Silver Creek, and what little employment documentation she possessed. Crawford examined each document with professional thoroughness, comparing signatures and checking dates with obvious suspicion. "These credentials appear legitimate," Crawford said finally. "But I don't see any territorial employment authorization or school district assignment." Ruby May had prepared for this question, but delivering a convincing lie to a territorial marshal still required every ounce of courage she possessed. "The position here is temporary," she explained. "I was traveling through the territory when I learned that this community needed educational assistance. I agreed to help until they could secure permanent arrangements through official channels." "And you're not receiving territorial salary or benefits?" "No, sir. The community provides room and board in exchange for teaching services. It's a private arrangement between myself and local families." Crawford made notes in his own journal. "How long do you plan to continue this arrangement?" "Until the community can arrange for an officially appointed teacher through territorial education authorities." It was a plausible explanation that positioned Ruby May as a temporary volunteer rather than a permanent employee, which might avoid immediate legal complications. But Patterson had been conducting his own investigation while Crawford questioned Ruby May. When they reconvened at the schoolhouse, his report contained details that made Ruby May's blood run cold. "Marshal," Patterson said quietly, "I think we need to examine this situation more carefully. I've observed educational materials and methods that seem unusually sophisticated for a frontier school. The children demonstrate knowledge levels that exceed typical territorial standards." Crawford's pale eyes sharpened with interest. "In what way?" "The older children show evidence of advanced mathematical concepts, scientific knowledge, and analytical thinking that suggests exposure to educational methods not typically available in remote settlements." Ruby May realized with growing horror that Patterson had detected traces of her innovative teaching approaches despite the children's careful performance. His trained eye had noticed subtle signs of sophisticated education that conventional frontier schooling couldn't explain. "Furthermore," Patterson continued, "some of the educational materials include texts and resources that would be expensive and difficult to obtain in this location. The community's investment in education appears to exceed what would be typical for a settlement of this size and economic level." Crawford was silent for a long moment, processing the implications of Patterson's observations. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to uncovering deception. "Miss Caldwell, I think you need to provide a more complete explanation of your educational program here. What we've observed suggests something significantly more complex than a temporary tutoring arrangement." Ruby May felt the weight of 18 children's futures, of an entire community's survival, resting on her next words. Everything Thomas Crow Dog and the other community leaders had built over 20 years could be destroyed by her response. But before she could speak, an unexpected intervention changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Marshal Crawford called a voice from the edge of the settlement. A rider was approaching at full gallop, dust clouds marking his urgent passage. Across the valley floor, the rider was James Washington, returning from what was supposed to be a routine trading expedition to Tucson. But his early return and obvious haste suggested serious problems. "Marshal," James called as he dismounted, "thank God you're here. We've got Apache raiders moving through the territory, hit 3 settlements in the past week. Territorial Command in Tucson is organizing response forces." Crawford's attention immediately shifted from educational investigations to immediate security concerns. "How many raiders? What's their direction of movement?" "Unknown numbers, sir, but they hit the Morrison Ranch yesterday, made off with livestock and supplies. Cavalry patrol from Fort McDowell is requesting support from all available territorial officers." The Apache raid report transformed the entire situation. Instead of being subjects of investigation, the residents of Yonder Valley suddenly became potential allies in dealing with a legitimate territorial emergency. "We need to coordinate defensive preparations," Crawford said, his earlier suspicions about educational irregularities now secondary to immediate security concerns. "Patterson, we'll have to complete our survey work later. Right now, we need to focus on protecting frontier settlements." But Ruby May realized that while the Apache threat had temporarily diverted official attention from their community, it had also created new dangers that could threaten everything they'd built in different ways. As Crawford and Patterson prepared to leave Yonder Valley to coordinate with territorial forces, Ruby May understood that their brief respite was only the beginning of challenges that would test whether the hidden community could survive in a rapidly changing world where isolation was no longer enough to guarantee safety. The children who had performed so brilliantly as conventional students were about to face tests that would require every skill Ruby May had taught them, and some that no school could prepare them for. 2 weeks after the territorial officials left Yonder Valley, a letter arrived that would force Ruby May to confront the most difficult decision of her life. Joseph Crow Dog brought it up from the valley's hidden mail drop, his usually calm expression troubled as he handed her the official envelope bearing the seal of the Kansas State Education Department. Ruby May's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the crisp government stationery inside. The letter was from Dr. Harrison Pemberton, Superintendent of Rural Education for Kansas, and its contents made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and dread. "Miss Caldwell," the letter began, "your innovative teaching methods and exceptional student outcomes in Silver Creek, Arizona Territory have come to our attention through territorial education reports. We would like to offer you a position as Regional Education Supervisor for Western Kansas, with responsibility for developing curriculum standards for frontier schools throughout the region. The position includes a substantial salary increase, housing allowance, and the opportunity to influence educational policy for thousands of children across multiple states." Ruby May read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Someone, probably Marshal Crawford or Surveyor Patterson, had filed a report about her work that had reached Kansas education authorities, but instead of triggering an investigation, her teaching had been interpreted as an innovative success worthy of recognition and promotion. The letter continued with details that made the offer almost impossible to refuse. "Your demonstrated ability to achieve exceptional academic outcomes in challenging frontier conditions, combined with your background in traditional education methods, makes you an ideal candidate for this leadership position." We are particularly impressed by reports of your students' advanced mathematical reasoning, scientific knowledge, and analytical writing skills." The irony was devastating. The very skills that had made her students exceptional, their ability to apply academic knowledge to real-world problems, their sophisticated understanding of complex subjects, their capacity for independent thinking, were being attributed to conventional teaching methods rather than the revolutionary integration techniques she had actually used. Ruby May sat by the stream that evening, watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, trying to process what the letter meant for her future. The position in Kansas represented everything she had once dreamed of achieving: professional recognition, the ability to influence educational policy, financial security, and the chance to improve education for thousands of children. But accepting the offer would mean abandoning the community that had given her a home, the students who had taught her as much as she had taught them, and the educational philosophy that had transformed her understanding of what teaching could be. Joseph found her there, as full darkness settled over the valley, bringing with him a cup of coffee and the quiet presence that had first drawn her to trust him at the abandoned mission. "Difficult news?" he asked, settling beside her on the grass. Ruby May handed him the letter without speaking. Joseph read it carefully in the starlight, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "This is a great honor," he said finally. "Recognition for work that most people will never understand or appreciate." "But it's recognition for the wrong reasons," Ruby May replied. "They think I achieved these results through conventional methods. They want to hire me to implement teaching approaches that are the exact opposite of what actually worked." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "What does your heart tell you to do?" The question cut straight to the core of Ruby May's conflict. Her mind could analyze the professional advantages, the financial benefits, the career opportunities that the Kansas position represented, but her heart knew that leaving yonder valley would mean abandoning the most meaningful work of her life. "My heart tells me to stay here," she admitted, "but my practical side says that's selfish. In Kansas, I could influence educational policy for thousands of children. Here, I'm only working with 18 students. 18 students who will grow up to be leaders, teachers, parents, and community builders," Joseph reminded her. 18 young people who understand that education should develop the whole person, not just fill their heads with disconnected facts. "But think of how many children I could help if I could change educational policy across multiple states." Joseph smiled. "Gently, Ruby May, you're thinking about this like someone who still believes that bigger always means better. But what if the most important changes happen one community at a time, one child at a time, one teacher at a time?" Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Crow Dog, who approached with obvious urgency. "Ruby May, we need to talk," Margaret said. "There's something you need to know before you make any decisions about that letter." Margaret led them to the home she shared with Thomas, where the community's elders had gathered for what appeared to be an emergency council meeting. Ruby May felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Had she somehow brought new danger to the valley? "Sit down, child," Margaret said gently. "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but it's time you knew the complete truth about why you're here." Ruby May settled onto a woven mat, her mind racing with possibilities. What truth had the community kept from her? Thomas Crow Dog spoke first, his weathered face grave in the lamplight. "Ruby May, Joseph didn't find you at that mission by accident. We've been watching you for months, long before you lost your position in Silver Creek." The words hit Ruby May like a physical blow. "Watching me? What do you mean?" "We have friends in many frontier towns," Thomas explained. People who understand that conventional education is failing children, especially in places where different cultures meet. They watch for teachers who seem to understand that learning should connect to life, not separate from it. Margaret continued the explanation. Pete Murphy from Silver Creek, the store owner who had to close his business, he's Joseph's cousin. He'd been sending us reports about your teaching methods for over a year. Ruby May felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding of everything that had happened. Pete Murphy is Cherokee? Half Cherokee, though he doesn't use his traditional name in Anglo communities, Joseph confirmed. He told us about a teacher who had her students calculating real mathematical problems instead of just memorizing tables, who taught geography by having children map their actual environment, who used local history to make larger historical concepts meaningful. The revelation that her rescue from the mission had been orchestrated rather than accidental was overwhelming. Ruby May had believed that Joseph's offer of help had been pure chance, a kindness from a stranger who happened to understand her desperation. "You planned all of this," she said, her voice hollow with the realization. "My job loss, my circumstances, everything that brought me here." "No," Thomas said firmly, "we didn't plan your misfortunes. But when Pete Murphy sent word that Silver Creek was closing and that you would need somewhere to go, we asked Joseph to make sure you knew that options existed." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes compassionate but determined. "Ruby May, we've spent 20 years building something precious in this valley, but we always knew that our isolation couldn't last forever. We needed someone who could help our children navigate between our world and the world that's coming. Someone who understood that education should preserve culture while preparing young people for change," added Don Miguel Herrera, who had been silent until now. "Someone who could teach our children to be proud of their heritage while giving them tools to succeed in Anglo society." The scope of what the community had been planning began to dawn on Ruby May. They hadn't just been looking for a teacher, they had been searching for someone who could help them transition from complete isolation to selective engagement with the outside world. "That letter from Kansas," Thomas continued, "represents exactly the kind of opportunity we hoped would come. Not for you to leave us, but for you to carry our educational philosophy into the broader world." Joseph pulled out a folder of documents that Ruby May had never seen before. "We've been documenting everything you've done here, the teaching methods, the student outcomes, the integration of practical and academic learning. We have letters from families whose children have thrived under your instruction, detailed curriculum guides that could be adapted for other communities, and evidence that this approach produces better results than conventional frontier education." Margaret smiled at Ruby May's shocked expression. "Child, did you think we were going to let the most important educational innovation in a generation remain hidden in a single valley?" The documents Joseph showed her were comprehensive and professionally prepared. Someone in the community had been carefully recording her teaching methods, documenting student progress, and analyzing the effectiveness of integrated education compared to conventional approaches. "Carlos Jr. has been keeping detailed journals of his learning experiences," Joseph explained. "Elena Washington has been documenting the mathematical applications she's discovered through practical work. Running Bear has created botanical studies that would impress university professors. All of this could support a proposal for educational reform that goes far beyond what any single teacher could accomplish working alone," Thomas said, "but it would require someone who understands both the methods and the philosophy behind them to present it effectively." Ruby May began to understand what the community was suggesting. They weren't asking her to choose between staying in yonder valley and accepting the Kansas position. They were proposing that she take their educational innovations into the broader world, using the Kansas position as a platform for implementing revolutionary changes in frontier education. "You want me to go to Kansas," Ruby May said slowly, "but to use the position to promote the teaching methods I've developed here. We want you to understand that you have more choices than staying or leaving," Margaret replied. "You could go to Kansas, establish these educational approaches in mainstream schools, and create a network of teachers who understand that learning should be meaningful rather than mechanical." The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. Ruby May had never imagined that her work in Yonder Valley could influence educational policy across multiple states. But the community was offering her the chance to take their collaborative approach to learning and make it available to thousands of children who were trapped in schools that separated education from real life. "What about the children here?" Ruby May asked. "If I leave, who will continue their education?" Sarah Crow Dog, who had been quietly listening to the entire conversation, finally spoke up. "That's the other part of the plan. Margaret and I have been learning your methods, documenting your approaches, preparing to continue the work you've started. And some of our older students are ready to begin teaching the younger ones," added Carlos Sr. "Elena Washington wants to develop workshops for children in other communities." Carlos Jr. has talked about traveling to frontier schools to demonstrate integrated learning techniques. Ruby May realized that the community had been preparing for this transition all along. They had never intended for her to remain as their only teacher forever. Instead, they had been using her expertise to develop their own educational capabilities, creating a sustainable system that could continue growing and evolving after she moved on. The choice she faced was no longer between personal fulfillment and professional advancement. It was between remaining in a role she had already completed successfully and taking on a new challenge that could transform education for frontier children throughout the American West. As Ruby May looked around the circle of faces that had become her family, she realized that Joseph's dream about a lost woman finding her way home had been more prophetic than she'd ever imagined. She had found her home in Yonder Valley, but her destiny lay in carrying the spirit of that home into a world that desperately needed what she had learned about teaching, community, and the true meaning of education. 5 years later, Ruby May. Caldwell stood before the assembled delegates of the Western States Education Conference in Denver, Colorado, holding a telegram that would validate everything she had sacrificed to get to this moment. The telegram was from Yonder Valley, and its message was simple but profound. 18 students, 12 now teaching in frontier schools across 4 territories. Your seeds have grown into a forest. Come home when you're ready. The transformation of Ruby May's life since leaving the Hidden Valley had been nothing short of extraordinary. Her position as regional education supervisor for Kansas had become a launching platform for educational reforms that were now being adopted across the entire American frontier. The integrated learning methods she had developed in Yonder Valley were being implemented in over 200 schools from Texas to Montana, fundamentally changing how thousands of children experienced education. But the real revolution had started with something much simpler. A curriculum guide titled Education for Life, integrating academic learning with practical skills for frontier communities. Ruby May had written it during her first winter in Kansas, working late into the night to document the teaching methods that had made the children of Yonder Valley so remarkable. The guide challenged every assumption about frontier education. Instead of viewing academic subjects as separate from daily life, it showed teachers how to use real-world problems as pathways to mathematical understanding, scientific discovery, and sophisticated reasoning skills. Instead of treating different cultural perspectives as obstacles to education, it demonstrated how diverse knowledge systems could enrich learning for all students. The initial response from educational authorities had been skeptical. Ruby May's Proposals seemed too radical, too complex for implementation in simple frontier schools with limited resources and undertrained teachers. But the results spoke for themselves. Schools that adopted Ruby May's methods reported dramatic improvements in student achievement, engagement, and retention. Children who had previously struggled with abstract concepts excelled when they could see practical applications for their learning. Students from different ethnic backgrounds thrived when their cultural knowledge was valued rather than suppressed. The breakthrough came during Ruby May's second year in Kansas, when Dr. Pemberton received a letter from the territorial governor of Arizona. Marshall Crawford, the same man who had investigated Yonder Valley, had been tracking educational outcomes in frontier communities and had noticed something remarkable. "The children from that small settlement we investigated," Crawford had written, "are achieving exceptional success in territorial schools and employment opportunities. Whatever educational methods they experienced, the results suggest approaches that merit serious consideration for broader implementation." Crawford's endorsement, combined with Ruby May's documented successes in Kansas, had opened doors to educational conferences, policy discussions, and pilot programs throughout the Western Territories. Ruby May found herself traveling constantly, training teachers, developing curricula, and advocating for educational approaches that honored both academic rigor and cultural diversity. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Every school that successfully implemented integrated learning methods validated the vision that the people of Yonder Valley had entrusted to her. Every teacher who learned to connect academic subjects to real-world applications was carrying forward the legacy of Cherokee wisdom, Mexican agricultural knowledge, and frontier resourcefulness that had shaped her own understanding of what education could be. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from the students themselves. Children who had previously seen school as irrelevant to their lives began viewing education as preparation for the challenges they would actually face as adults. Frontier communities that had struggled to provide meaningful schooling discovered that education could strengthen rather than undermine their cultural identities. Ruby May's success had come at a personal cost that she felt more acutely with each passing year. The administrative demands of her position left little time for direct teaching. The bureaucratic complexities of educational reform often frustrated her desire for immediate impact, and the political pressures of working within government systems sometimes forced compromises that diluted the pure vision she had experienced in Yonder Valley. Most painfully, she missed the daily interactions with children that had originally drawn her to teaching. Her work now involved training other teachers, writing policy documents, and attending meetings with officials who often seemed more interested in political advantages than educational outcomes. The telegram from Yonder Valley had arrived at a moment when Ruby May was questioning whether her broader influence was worth the loss of personal fulfillment she experienced in direct teaching. She had been invited to accept a position with the Federal Bureau of Education in Washington, D.C., an opportunity that would give her national influence over educational policy, but would move her even further from actual classrooms and real children. Standing before the Denver conference delegates, Ruby May made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of presenting the policy recommendations she had prepared, she began telling the story of 18 children in a hidden valley who had taught her that the purpose of education was not to separate learning from living, but to make them inseparable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ruby May began, setting aside her prepared remarks, "I want to tell you about a place where Cherokee teenagers can calculate complex engineering problems because they learned mathematics by building water management systems, where Mexican-American children write sophisticated botanical reports because they learned science by studying traditional plant medicine, where Anglo children understand multiple cultural perspectives because they learned history from people who lived it, rather than from textbooks written by strangers. The audience, expecting a typical educational policy presentation, listened with growing fascination as Ruby May described the revolutionary learning community that had shaped her understanding of what schools could accomplish. These children didn't just learn academic subjects, Ruby May continued. They learned that knowledge exists to solve real problems, that different cultural approaches to the same challenge often produce better solutions than any single perspective, and that education should prepare them to build bridges between worlds rather than walls around their own assumptions. She pulled out letters from former students that she carried with her everywhere, updates on their achievements, their contributions to their communities, their success in both traditional and non-traditional paths. Carlos Herrera Jr. is now teaching integrated agriculture and mathematics in 3 territorial schools, showing children that farming requires sophisticated scientific knowledge and complex problem-solving skills. Elena Washington has established workshops for young women that combine traditional crafts with mechanical engineering principles. Running Bear Crow Dog is working with the territorial government to develop policies that protect indigenous plant species while making traditional medicine knowledge available to frontier communities. The impact of these individual success stories resonated through the conference hall. These weren't abstract educational theories. They were real young people who had become leaders, innovators, and bridge builders between different communities and different ways of understanding the world. Ruby May's presentation concluded with a proposal that stunned the assembled educators and policymakers. I am requesting support for a network of demonstration schools based on the integrated learning model developed in Arizona Territory. Instead of trying to reform education through policy mandates, we will create examples of what becomes possible when children learn to see academic knowledge as tools for improving their communities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Territorial governors requested pilot programs for their regions. Philanthropists offered funding for teacher training institutes. Educational reformers from as far away as California and Oregon requested consultations for implementing integrated learning approaches. But for Ruby May, the most meaningful response came in a private conversation after her presentation with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the first woman to earn a doctorate in education from Harvard University. Miss Caldwell, Dr. Mitchell said, "What you've described isn't just educational reform, it's a completely different philosophy of human development. You're proposing that schools should strengthen communities rather than extract the most talented children from them." "That's exactly right," Ruby May replied. "Education should be about developing people who can contribute to the places they come from, not just preparing them to leave for supposedly better opportunities elsewhere." Dr. Mitchell smiled. "I think you've discovered something that could transform not just frontier education, but the entire American approach to schooling. Would you be interested in documenting this work for national publication?" The offer to write a book about her educational philosophy represented another crossroads in Ruby May's journey. National publication could influence educational policy throughout the United States, potentially affecting millions of children. But it would also require her to remain in the world of policy and administration, further removed from direct teaching. Ruby May's answer came from a place deeper than professional ambition or personal preference. It came from her understanding of what Joseph Crow Dog had meant when he said that some people are called to be lighthouse keepers, maintaining beacons that guide others to safety, even when the work is solitary and the results are often invisible. "Dr. Mitchell," Ruby May said, "I would be honored to write that book, but I want to write it from yonder valley, working directly with the students and teachers who developed these methods. The best way to document revolutionary education is To practice it, 6 months later, Ruby May stood once again at the entrance to the hidden canyon that had changed her life. But this time she wasn't a desperate woman fleeing failure. She was an educational pioneer, returning home to write the book that would carry the vision of Yonder Valley into schools across America. Joseph Crow Dog was waiting for her at the same spot where he had first offered her sanctuary, but now his greeting carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "Welcome home, teacher," he said, using the title the community had given her. "The children are waiting to show you what they've learned from the seeds you planted." The valley had grown and changed during her absence, but its essential character remained unchanged. New families had joined the community, drawn by reports of the educational opportunities available to their children. The original 18 students had become teachers, mentors, and leaders who were spreading integrated learning methods throughout the Southwest. Ruby May's book, The Valley School Education as Community Building, became the foundational text for a movement that transformed American education. But for Ruby May herself, the greatest reward was returning to daily work with children who understood that learning was not preparation for life. It was life itself, lived with curiosity, purpose, and commitment to making the world better than they found it. Standing in the classroom where she had first learned to teach, Ruby May realized that Joseph's dream about a woman finding her way home had been prophetic in ways none of them had imagined. She had found her home, left it to share its gifts with the world, and returned to discover that home had grown larger than any single place could contain. The woman who had once slept on church steps, believing she had nothing left to lose, had become the teacher who proved that the most powerful education happens when we learn to see every child as a potential bridge builder, every community as a classroom, and every challenge as an opportunity to discover what becomes possible when we refuse to accept that things must remain as they have always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.